good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Not All Wounds Are Visible. It's a community conversation series on mental health. We're glad that you're here. Not All Wounds Are Visible is one of two community conversation series that the University of Maryland Medical System sponsors. One is on physical health. That's called Let's Talk About Health, and those are every month from September to June. And Not All Wounds Are Visible appear periodically and, of course, focus on mental wellness. As Connie said, I'm Donna Jacobs, and I'm delighted to moderate today's conversation on behalf of UMS. The Not All Wounds Are Visible community conversation, as I said, focus on issues related to mental and behavioral health issues. And our goals are pretty simple: to increase awareness and help remove stigmas related to mental health, to help get people comfortable talking about mental health. It's sometimes something that we shy away from, and the more that we bring light to it, the better. And of course, to overall just simply improve mental wellness. Today, with our conversation entitled De-stressing in an Era of Constant Stress, Is It Possible? We focus on the issues that are related to the stressful environment that we find ourselves in on a daily basis. And we focus on some strategies, most importantly, that can help us cope. To start our conversation today, we have two experts that will be sharing with you, Dr. Connie Knoll and Alan Siegel, Dr. Siegel. And we also have with us, gladly, Dr. Ramesh, who will be here to help us with the Q&A. Dr. Knoll, let's go back to Dr. Knoll. Dr. Knoll has presented in this forum many times. She's a well-respected psychiatric nurse practitioner with many years of experience across a wide array of administrative and teaching roles. She practices at the University of Maryland, Upper Chesapeake Health System, and she's the current chair of the Recovery Council of the American Psychiatric Nurses Association. When I first met her, so many years ago now, Connie, she served as a mental health volunteer for the American Red Cross and provided services to victims and families following tragedies, including but not limited to some tremendous ones: the Oklahoma City bombing, 9/11, both in New York City and at Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana. Next slide. Dr. Alan Siegel is the chaplain and director of spiritual care services, also at the University of Maryland, Upper Chesapeake Health System. He's board certified chaplain and ordained interfaith minister, and he holds certificates in health ministry, some difficult areas, palliative care, ethics, and critical incident stress management. He's also a certified registered nurse, United States Health Services chaplain, and an American Red Cross disaster spiritual care chaplain. Dr. Siegel often facilitates resilience talks with staff and coordinates the RISE program, RISE Peer Responder Program, and CIS teams at Chesapeake. There's a work called PACE Yourself. As I mentioned, will join us for the Q&A, is the chair of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Maryland Capital Region Health, our hospitals down in the Capital Region area, and he has been the chair since 2015, so we're very pleased to have him join us. Before I turn the program over to our speakers, let me share a few notes with you. Let me underline what Connie said. We will have a Q&A at the end, and as with all of our sessions, this session is meant to be interactive, so we want to know what's on your mind and try to address your questions. Please type your questions at any time, if you choose, into the Q&A box, not the chat, but the Q&A box, and we will respond to as many of those as are possible. We also ask that you please ask questions that are for the general knowledge of anyone listening. In other words, please try to refrain from asking questions related to your specific mental health status at any given point. That would be difficult for us to think about diagnosing and giving adequate answers over the line. I would also note for you that this conversation is being recorded. The slides will be available to you as well as a replay of this conversation in just a few days. And so with that, let me turn this over to you, Connie. I believe you will address the group first.
Can I have the next slide, please? Hi, and good afternoon. It's really my pleasure and privilege to be here in this very important conversation about mental health in such a time we've been living through, particularly for the 2.5 years. I have talked to many patients and colleagues and coworkers about how these past few years have been sort of extraordinarily stressful. And so I think it's really a timely thing to talk about continuous stress, because that is kind of what it feels like. We have a couple objectives for our talk today. First is really, as I just said, to acknowledge the hardships that have occurred over the past few years in what seems like extraordinary stressors. Our emphasis will be on some practical tips for maintaining your health and function, and to think about moving forward, maybe moving from surviving to thriving, or perhaps pausing and standing in place to reevaluate how things are for you. Next slide, please. So I don't want to go into this too much because I want to avoid causing trauma, actually. But I just put up a list of things that we're all dealing with in our own ways. And just as a brief list, we are currently dealing with a great deal of economic hardships. The pandemic is ongoing, and we're dealing with waves of contagion and individuals. We're still dealing, if you think about in the United States, about 1,040,000 people have died from COVID. There's a lot of loss and there's a lot of death. There's people who deal with symptoms. And then, you worry about whether you have a flu or whether you have an allergy or whether you have COVID. It's something that continuously happens. But on top of all that, we've had some extraordinary social and political unrest that also has affected people in terms of their ability to perhaps function, or as I have talked about with some of my colleagues, it's when you're at work, you have to act as though nothing outside of work is happening, and you have to focus on what's at hand if you want to get through the day and do a good job. And sometimes that is very difficult. And we've had an outbreak of global war in terms of what's been going on in Ukraine. We have, and we're living through currently a terrific heat wave, but there's lots of catastrophic weather threats and threats and events that have been going on. And then in particularly for mental health, there are clear access issues. Either insurance doesn't cover some of the things, services that are necessary, or they partially cover, or people have limitations. And so those things go into this list of what I have called the bombardment of stressors. Next slide, please. So just to review some of the things that could be happening when you're thinking that you might be overstressed is a feeling of being physically or mentally drained, as you had no energy to get through the day, or just you wake up and you're not sure how you're going to get through the day. You might have difficulty with concentrating or focusing and making decisions that you once thought 2 seconds about, and now you are perplexed as to what you have to do. If you notice that your level of frustration, your trigger for being angry and irritable has changed, that is a clear sign of stress. And feeling, I think particularly if you start to feel like you are numb, in addition to perhaps feeling sad, worried, lonely, or just tired, but numbness is a key that your system is probably on overload and you need to do something to de-stress. Other clear signs include changes in appetite and sleep, and your usual ways of handling things, your coping skills, or the things that you've done to give yourself pep talks and be resilient have just stopped being effective. Next slide. So I think one of the things to really start to drill down on this is the acknowledgement that everyone doesn't cope in the same way. And so when various events happen that are stressful, what is the meaning of that event to that individual? What conflicts does it bring up for the individual? And is there a safety factor or a risk of someone being in harm's way or yourself being in harm's way because of whatever the stressor is? And there are individual factors that have to do with a person's age, the developmental stage of their life, their gender, what style of personality they have, what kind of culture, values, beliefs an individual has, how they have coped with difficulties in the past, and a person's ability to find meaning or purpose in life, have a sense of understanding of what is going on and how they can deal with it. And then the circumstances, how close is the threat to you? Are you able to meet your basic needs? Are you able to return to any kind of usual function if you've been hit with a particular stressor? Next slide, please. So I'd like to go over a few concepts about resilience. I've heard that some people are tired of hearing about resilience because they feel like they don't have any reservoir for it anymore. But what this really talks about is your ability to recover from acute stressors and your ability to continue to try to function as best you can in the face of what could be acute or persistent and chronic difficulties. And if you do sort of lose your balance and have a misstep, let's say maybe you get really upset and you have to leave work, or you feel like you have to call a family member and drop the kids off because you can't deal with it, or you feel like you need a mental health day from work because you can't, how quickly can you sort of regain your composure, get in touch with your ideas about how to cope with things and move on in a way that's more functional? And then lastly, resilience has to do with the adaptation that you make to continue healthy habits and being the best person you can be every day. Next slide, please. So I love to use this cartoon, and I've used it many times in the past, because there is, I think, sometimes individuals who are seeking mental health or behavioral health care think that they're going to be measured against some sort of yardstick of normal. Now, there are things that are clearly abnormal, and those generally are clearest when someone is doing something that's an illegal activity, or it's very different from social norms. So I use this slide to begin to suggest that what's normal for an individual is not necessarily what's normal for a different individual. As we talked about in the previous slides, there's cultural aspects, there's personality styles and traits. So what is normal for you may not be normal for a different person. So really the concept is, how different from your usual are you? And that's how we begin to look at assessing what kinds of things you might want to work on to do differently that are keeping you from being your normal self or your best self. Next slide, please. So this little cartoon, if you can't read it, it says, everybody else seems so happy and normal. I wish I wasn't the only person with mental health issues. Well, I can assure you that in the past few years, that every person that I know, and myself included, has been challenged by the amount of stressors that have gone on and has had to think about this and has not felt like their usual self. And so it may seem that everyone else is doing okay and you're not, but in fact, many people are struggling with the same things. I would also say that I've heard, in terms of the pandemic at least, this sort of thought of we're all in the same boat. Well, actually, we're not in the same boat. We're in the same storms, but we're not in the same boats. There are a lot of differences depending on your background, your financial status, your abilities. There are many things that are variables in terms of someone's capacity to deal with what's going on. So we're going to start to think about, how are you doing now? What is it that you're feeling? How are you doing now? How are you functioning now with all the stressors that are going on, and what you've done so far with what happened in the past few years? Next slide. So I think that thinking about this normal, whether you think of it as a new normal, is that people may not often think of expecting emotional negative experiences. But in fact, normal human response to stress is to feel stressed. Stress is a way you push yourself through something to reach the other side of it. And feeling anxious or depressed or going through grief are normal responses to overwhelming stressors or acute stressors or persistent stressors. So I think part of understanding dealing with stress and unusual circumstances or catastrophic circumstances is that the negative experiences are part of the normal experience. And I think the other thing that we've learned in terms of especially COVID is that these things do tend to come in waves. So you might be adjusting and feeling good, and then something else happens, and then you get a flood of negative emotions again. I think one of the things that is important to understand is that if you've had a traumatic experience and you've had maybe signs of trauma response, and you adjust and you are going along okay perhaps, but when something else that's traumatic happens, even if it's not related to the first traumatic experience, it has a way of re-triggering that trauma response. So again, the thing to emphasize here is that the negative emotions are part of a normal reaction to something that's an extreme stress. Next slide. So, and then I think it's important, as I've sort of alluded to so far, is to talk about stress versus an inability to function. And an important sort of list of things for you to think about for yourself. And the first thing is, am I sleeping well? Am I eating healthily, drinking enough fluids? Because fueling your body appropriately and getting the optimum amount of sleep is a sure way to make sure that you're feeling at your best physically. Those things physically propel you to be able to cope better with whatever's happening. And then another question is, am I taking care of myself? So taking care of yourself goes beyond sleeping, making sure you get an adequate sleep, making sure that you have good nutrition, drinking enough fluids. But also, are you satisfied in your relationships? Are you working on your relationships? Do you do things for leisure and enjoyment? Are you feeling productive, either in an academic sense or perhaps a work sense, or is getting things done at home? And then the last question to ask yourself is, do I feel safe? And this is really, these four areas, I think, if you're coming up with a lot of negatives in these four questions, we do have some resources at the end that we want to tell you about, but these would be cues that perhaps your usual coping strategies aren't working sufficiently, and you may need additional assistance or additional help. Next slide, please. So this is another thing I wanted to put in for today's talk, because I myself have rethought my priorities in life. I've had some hard thinking about what's really important to me. I remember after so many months, years of isolation during the pandemic, when I was finally able to actually physically visit with my adult children and not just have Zoom meetings, those hugs and those tears were more real and valuable to me than anything else that I could think of. So many people have undergone rethinking the meaning and purpose of life and what their life is and what they want it to be and what they don't want it to be. And so very often when that happens, we rethink our religious beliefs, or we rethink spiritual notions. And the whole idea of nourishing your soul is critical in terms of thinking about dealing with persistent stress that has the capacity to shake you up and make you think about whether you're functioning well. Next slide. So when you think about wellness for yourself, it's important, and I think it's not even a good idea to make a physical list and write things down. What makes you think and feel your best every day? Is it starting off, for me, I like to have an egg or a protein at breakfast, no sweets, because then I really have enough energy and stuff to get me through the morning. Another interesting question to ask yourself is, what makes you feel like you can deal with anything? And I'll tell you that one of the things that I think is, when I work with certain colleagues and I know that I have that backup, and I know that I have people that are really kindred spirits, I feel like I can do anything at work. So, and I think that happens on the home front as well. In other words, when you feel like you have little moments of joy or little moments of happiness, or things that you might think of as taking a little picture in your mind to replay at night, having those like little moments, treasured moments, can get you through some really negative things that happen. So I would challenge you to think about, when you have a better day, examine it. What went into that day being better? What went into that you feeling different that day? And then you may be able to come up with a list that, if you hadn't thought of those things, you would start thinking of those kinds of things in terms of what you can do every day to be your best self. And I think that with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Siegel, and I thank you for your listening attention.
Well, thank you, Dr. Knoll. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Alms for the opportunity to be here, and thank you for the participants for joining us today in this really important conversation. So, Dr. Knoll's presented a lot of really good information, a lot of great questions, a lot of self-reflecting questions that I think are critical when we're trying to figure out how to move through the stresses that we have in life. So one of the things to think about is perspective. Perspective definitely drives the way we think, we feel. If we feel like we're entering into the day feeling with negative energy, not so optimistic, that perspective is really going to shift the way we experience that day. So I want to just talk about maybe starting the day off what we call thriving. We would love to see every one of us thrive and to be the best potential, the best self that we can be. I believe the first place to go to is to love yourself. You know, that sense of loving kindness, that place that you can say to yourself, I matter really the most here, because if I'm not at my best, then everything around me is not going to be potentially at its best as well. You know, for parents, we always hold up the airline stewardess as the example of, you know, in the event the oxygen mask comes down, you hold the mask, you put it on you first before you put it on your child. If it really is about that same principle, can you nourish yourself? Can you love yourself? Can you give yourself permission to love yourself in a way that allows for nourishment? So thinking about the day from a positive perspective, if you can, you know, what is going to happen today that's going to be positive? What's the positivity that I can bring into my day? Will it have some routine? Will it have some scheduling? Or do I need to invite some flexibility in my day? I always joke about driving up Route 24 to the hospital, and I have all these plans in my head, and when I get here, I literally, in my brain, take my plans and I throw them in the garbage, and I start again based on what's happening here, not based on what I would like to see happen here. So introducing some flexibility has really helped me a lot. If it starts to become a day where I'm feeling that drain, that emotional drain, that physical drain, that starts to feel negative, at any point, do you have an emergency plan? And I'd like to introduce two concepts about that. One is mindfulness. Can you take a moment to say, okay, I'm going to take a moment, I'm going to think about what I'm feeling, I'm going to think about my thoughts, I'm going to see if I can just be mindful about what's happening right now. Can I do some breath work? Breath work is amazing because it taps into our healing system, our parasympathetic system. And when we do that breath work, when we take that breath in and we slowly let it out, it helps calm us. It helps turn down that stress response system so that maybe things just seem a little bit easier. You know, I always ask nurses if they feel overwhelmed, do something cognitive, do a thinking task, count to 10, look at a painting, think about your shoes, but do a thinking task. And that actually helps as well because it moves us from our emotional state more into our cognitive state. So being able to think and breathe and be mindful. I heard a phrase a couple of months ago that I loved. It was, can you calm and fuel? I love that. Do you need to take a moment to place yourself in a place of calmness, but also to hydrate? Or do you need a small snack or something to fuel your body in that moment? So some things to think about from an emergency plan. And when you have those negative emotions, you know, remind yourself, I'm better than this. I'm stronger than this. I've been through other events in my life that have transformed me, and I can do this. And if the worst happens, what's my plan? What will I be doing to respond in a way that I can overcome what's happening to me right now? Next slide, please. So at the end of your day, I invite you to also think about and reflect on and feel what the day's been like for you, to remind yourself of the positives, you know, what the day was like. How did you contribute to somebody else's day in a positive way? How did somebody else contribute to your day in a positive day? What made it a good or better day? You know, that question that Dr. Knoll placed earlier. And if you discover that they're less than positive and what you would describe as negative, if that's your language, I invite you to forgive. Number one, if you feel you're involved in a failing, please forgive yourself. Love yourself enough to forgive yourself and to release that negative energy and to free yourself of it. And then to forgive others who may have wronged you in some way. You know, everyone is trying to do the best they can, and everyone is under this incredible amount of stress right now. And being, you know, we're so interconnected, and being just loving and compassionate to other people, to allow that space of forgiveness for their failings as well is really important. It frees us of that energy. It allows us to let go of it. I talked about earlier finding that I need to definitely be flexible in the course of my day. If I'm rigid, if I have a plan and it doesn't go my way, then I'm going to cause my own stress by not allowing that flexibility. Buddha would talk about this impermanence. The day is impermanent. It's subject to constant change, and to be able to embrace that. To celebrate your accomplishments and achievements. What did the day bring to you that you made a difference? How did others make a difference for you? And to be able to celebrate those little moments that make up such a positive aspect of our day. To keep refining. Well, it didn't go well today with what I planned. Let me try a new strategy. And I'm going to talk about some strategies in a moment. But I'll tell you, I think one of the best things that works is a sense of gratitude. Gratitude is so powerful. It is known to help our physical health. It improves our sleep. It makes us more peaceful at night, so we want that inner peace. It improves our psychological health. It increases our compassion and empathy. It certainly reduces aggression. It enables us to feel more socially connected and enhances our own self-esteem. And so these are wonderful attributes of gratitude that you can bring into your own life and really nurture yourself with. Next slide, please. So some things to practice. The mind, body, spirit is really strong here. And what affects the body affects the mind and the spirit. What affects the mind affects the body and spirit. And what affects the spirit, we talk about the soul, that really true essence of who we are, affects the body and affects the mind. So making sure, if you can, to introduce some physical activity, aerobic, strengthening exercise, something that allows you to do movement, something that allows your muscles to move, to release that tension that's built up into your muscles, to free those muscles so that you feel more energetic. I talked earlier about breath exercise. You can do that for a moment, or you can spend 20 minutes doing it. It has absolutely been shown to have incredible, powerful, positive effects on your physical and mental health when you do breath work exercise. And while you're doing it and just focusing on your breath work and you're calming, that stress response, the sympathetic system and your healing system is in play, you might have some thoughts, and that's okay. If you find all of a sudden you've moved away from the breath work and you're not counting anymore, breath in and breath out, just remind yourself, oh, I was thinking, and go back to your breath work. It's simple as that. Yoga, a lot of people do yoga. Some people do the hot yoga. Some people do regular yoga. But yoga has been shown to show incredible stress reduction and wonderful healing effects to the body. Meditation is used often. You're hearing a lot of buzzword out there in the community. In the faith world, it might be called centering prayer. But it is the ability to sit and reflect on something and to be sit in stillness. It could be an image, it could be your breath work, it could be something relative to your faith, but it's the ability to just sit and just calmly breathe and just focus on something that's incredibly positive for you and that would bring you some calming and inner peace. Gratitude I talked about, and then immersing yourself in a creative outlet, or letting that creative juices flow. A hobby. I just took up Native American flute in October, so I'm learning to play that as part of my new self-care strategy, and I'm playing virtual reality games as well to stimulate my mind. So I'm doing some body work. Again, flexibility, introducing, what's now working, because what I was doing wasn't really working. I wasn't getting that stimulus and that physical activity. And then be able to express your feelings. If you're somebody who journals, if you're somebody that needs to have a great partner to be a listener for you, finding that one person that can listen to you. That'd be awesome. Okay, next, please. And again, more things to practice. Dr. Knoll talked about meaning and purpose, really important. If we don't have a sense of our meaning and purpose and what we're working with or what we're thinking about, it really does affect us in an adverse way. It's really important that we feel connected to the essence of what's going on in our life, but also to people, to the transcendent, to the God, if you will, the God of whatever you're naming, that deity, to others, and certainly to ourselves, and to creation, the beautiful place of creation. I talked earlier about forgiveness and love, but also being able to trust and to have faith and hope. Hope's really important. Sometimes hope has to change. Sometimes we place our hope in one area and we discover that's not going to happen, and we have to change our hope and pursue it in a different way. I talked earlier about loving kindness, but adding that inner harmony and peace. Imagine going into whatever you're doing, work or social connection, with just a profound sense of inner peace and harmony, and what a difference that would be for all of us. Making sure that your life is aligned with your moral values and belief systems. That's so important, because then you feel disconnected or fragmented in a way. And your willingness, as we've shared earlier, Dr. Knoll's questions, the importance of self-reflection and receptivity to change, the positive attitude we've talked about, and pursuing your greatest potential. I always tell everyone I meet, we're always the best person we can be in that moment. But do you have desire to be more than who you are in that moment? And what would that look like for you? And certainly, last but not least, the spiritual and religious activities that nourish your soul. What do they look like? How do you bring them in? And in the spiritual realm, what we're talking about is nurturing who you are. Religious activities are supportive of a belief system that you have that's connected to your spirituality, but spirituality could be sitting in a park. It could be I sit in the backyard and I watch the birds feed off my feeder, and I feed the deer, and I watch the new moms bring the fawns up. And for me, that's a spiritual, nourishing activity. Next slide, please. So the other part is try to find enjoyment. It's really just a little bit each day helps a lot. Allow it to be a distraction. Allow it to be a diversion. It is important that you still experience fun. You know, we were created to be joyful people, I believe, and we've lost a little of our fun along the way. It has not been a fun couple of years. It's really challenging. But can we find moments of just enjoying something for what it is and having fun? And again, we talked about gratitude, but also appreciation and counting your blessings. So really important. You know, we could always look at the dark side, but I've discovered in every person that I've ever met and had the privilege of journeying with and being a companion with, in that darkness of their life and that whatever's causing that profound stress or stressors, there's always been a blessing. And focusing in that and reframing that perspective on that blessing has been really helpful. Next slide. So some ways to kind of say, all right, how am I doing? From a positive perspective, are you growing? Are your resiliency efforts paying off, that you're finding, you know what, I'm coping better today than I was yesterday? Or, you know what, I found I could cope today with that stress, and maybe a month ago I couldn't cope with that stress. So how are you growing? How are you growing spiritually? How are you growing in your physical wellness? And how are you growing in your cognitive, your mindful wellness? What wisdom have you learned from the stress events? There's the possibility that there's always wisdom there. There's always something to learn. And is that available to you? Does what you've been through, be it with your stress and the reflections that you've done, has it led to you to make better future decisions about yourself? I know a lot of people, as Dr. Knoll talked about, priorities have shifted, probably for all of us. And I know that Dr. Knoll and myself, and probably Dr. Ramesh as well, a lot of our colleagues have left the industry, have decided, you know what, our priorities at this point are we're not going to stay in the healthcare industry anymore. Our life is going to focus a little differently. So perhaps there's a decision that's coming your way that you're going to be more involved with. And can you become your own advocate as you self-reflect on what's happening in terms of being able to transform your stress into a moment of really thriving and being enlivened and living well? Thank you. And finally, there's a host of resources for you. There's a number of websites that we've pulled up for you. And we want to talk about, Dr. Knoll, if you could, did you want to talk about the 988 number?
Thank you. As just last Saturday, you can now call just 3 numbers to get to the National Suicide Hotline. And this is and it is operational in Maryland. And so we're very happy to lead that with our resource list. I think there has been some discussion of this being also a place to call if you're feeling like you want to talk to someone. So I think that it can be used for mental health and suicide, if you feel suicidal, which of course is an extreme of what we were talking about earlier. in terms of somebody's inability to function or feeling unsafe. But the other, some of these sites are scientific, that give some of the background of some of the things that we've discussed today. And some of them are very user-friendly, more put in non-scientific terms, especially the Cleveland Clinic health article on stress is always a good one. So I think we're going to open it up now for, we have about 20 or so minutes.
Yes, we have a couple of questions. Let me just say first, thank you both for that. I found it not only, personally I'll speak, I found it not only informative, but very calming actually. So I'm grateful to you for all that you shared. A couple of questions here. Somebody's asking about the handouts. So I'll go over it again at the end. This information will be available to you in a couple of days. It has been recorded, so you'll be able to see all of this again, and the slides will be available for you to view again if you like. So Dr. Knoll, well, actually, Dr. Knoll and Dr. Ramesh, I want to get you here in this conversation. You spoke about expecting stress to cause stress, and that was depression and anxiety. So, Dr. Ramesh, how do we know when it's more than stress, than expected stress? Dr. Ramesh, you might have to unmute.
Sorry, I was talking and didn't realize that I'm muted. Thank you for the question. Yes, as Dr. Knoll presented very beautifully, what is the expected? We are all going to go through stress. Okay, stress is a good thing. Only when it crosses the line where we are unable to cope and use that stress to make us grow and make us cope with this, the stressful situation in front of us, then it becomes something that we need help and becomes something like on the spectrum of depression or anxiety kind of thing. So I would say the threshold is different for different person. Just like the presentation was done, the resilience plays a factor. Stress, which can make someone be productive, can impair someone else as well based on the resilience factor. So stress is a good thing, but you are the ones who can tell whether it's causing you to be impaired or causing you to be adapt and perform better. Does it answer the question, Donna?
Yes, it does. So thank you for that. I have another question here that I'll just address, which is, can we, the listeners, get credit for this session? Let me just remind everyone, these are produced by the University of Maryland Medical System for the community. They're produced by our system Community Health Coalition, and they're meant to be general for everyone. They're not necessarily addressed for practitioners, so credit for practitioners is not offered through all of these. Let me just remind our listeners that you can drop a question in the Q&A. We just have a couple of more minutes, and I've got a lightning rod question here, which maybe is fair, which maybe is not fair, but we'll pose it anyway. And it's to each of you. I'll start with you, Dr. Ramesh, and then Dr. Siegel, Dr. Knoll. You've offered so many coping mechanisms here. And for those of us, I'm embellishing the question a little bit, but for those of us who are already stressed, you've given us all these things, and I got all these things to think about. Give me, in your terms, or from your opinion, what's the one thing people should do? And this is a 15-second thing, and why, on a daily basis to keep ourselves centered. I know it probably is unfair, but I framed the question a little differently than it came in. Dr. Ramesh, what should we do every day to try to keep ourselves balanced?
I think we should count our blessings, appreciate what we have, and not focus on the glass half empty rather than glass half full. Learn to be thankful, like Dr. Siegel said, have a sense of gratitude and try to work on things that we can do to improve and further ourselves, but not be so negative on ourselves that it impairs us to grow, is what I would think, in my opinion.
All right, great. Dr. Siegel.
Thank you, Dr. Ramesh. So I wrote 3 words down: gratitude, thanksgiving, and blessings. I just think if we can get there, I have been on deployments, and Dr. Knoll can speak as well, I'm sure, to this, but when people they lost everything and they're in a shelter, what gets them through is a sense of gratitude, thanksgiving, or blessing. One of those 3 things. It's just so much to help them and to help them find hope in this circumstance.
Thank you for that. And you made me think about something. Often we see or we read or we hear about people who have lost absolutely everything, who may be living on the street, and yet you see them giving kind gestures to someone else who may even be more blessed in the moment than they are. And you wonder, how is it that they do that? But that's just triggered for me that's a coping mechanism, perhaps. Thank you. Dr. Knoll.
Well, I'd like to pick up on something that Dr. Siegel said, and I think the one thing to do is to love yourself, which covers everything that Dr. Ramesh and Dr. Siegel said in terms of blessings, gratitude, and self-care. Loving yourself is not a selfish thing. It's something that's really essential. And I think, Dr. Siegel, you also mentioned, if you're on an airplane and you're feeling turbulence and the people that are the attendants don't look like they're phased, that helps you. So I think that perspective, loving yourself, understanding that self-care is not selfish, and that sometimes I saw something on Facebook, and I do enjoy Facebook. It's not an academic source, but it does give you little sayings sometimes that are great. And it had something to do with, loving yourself, and self-care is not just going to the spa and having, some nice dinner. Sometimes it means standing up for yourself, changing relationships. Sometimes it means going through some things that you found difficult. But the opportunity, stress and crisis brings you to a point of self-examination and deciding what you want to go forward with. So thinking of it as an opportunity also helps. I know I said about 10 things, not one, but I couldn't help myself.
Well, you all said such related things, and it really is put your oxygen mask on first. And thinking about yourself first and as central, we call it centering, is ever so important. And I hope that that's a message that everyone has heard loudly and clearly and multiple times and will walk away with today. I want to say thank you to the 3 of you for doing this today and for helping all of us. Your messages were loud and clear for me, and I hope that they are for the others. If we can have the next slide, I don't see any more questions, so I want to go on. And just remind everyone that this session will be available to you to look at again. If you go to the site that we have there, ums.org/community/conversations, you can look at any of the sessions, including today, that we have conducted on behavioral health, on mental wellness there. And many of them are listed there on the bottom for you. And that might be our last slide. Let's see if there's one more. Simple thank you. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for attending. And if you got an email notification about this session, you will certainly get more in the future when we're doing not only these on mental wellness and behavioral health, but also on somatic health, on physical health issues, and the series that's called Let's Talk. So once again, thank you all for attending, and thank you certainly speakers and Dr. Ramesh for your presentations today. And have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.